This series contains adult language and depictions of graphic violence. Listener discretion is advised. When I was a junior in high school, I spent most of my time at the local pool hall. I wasn't a very good player, I wasn't disciplined enough to put in the time to become a good player, and I didn't quite have the confidence in my game when there was real money on the line. But I loved the atmosphere. It was exactly how you're probably picturing a New Jersey pool hall in the early 90s. There was a wall of video games and pinball, a few vending machines, then a large area of about 20 pool tables, and then a long, low countertop with bar stools where you could sit and watch all the action. I spent a good amount of time at that counter, eating pizza and watching the masters at work. And there were the usual personalities. The quiet, almost zen-like older men who shot straight pool for hours on end, meticulous and brilliant. There was the young, charismatic whirlwind who dominated the 9-ball money games from Boston to Philadelphia. And then there were always the guys with pool tables in their basements who felt like they could give it a shot with the big boys, and then they would always get sent home broke. And every month or so, there would be a night when Sterling Billiards, that was the name of the place, Sterling Billiards would welcome some out-of-town players who were, quote, on the road, meaning they were traveling pool hustlers, making their living in rooms just like Sterling. Sometimes they'd be on a cross-country trip, other times they would just be in from New York or Baltimore and wanted action. Either way, given our location, Sterling Billiards was almost always on the list. But what was the action like on those nights? You spend any time in a pool room, you'll understand that the winner is usually decided in the pre-game negotiations. A player would pretend to be weak and ask for a spot, meaning an advantage, kind of like a golfer's handicap. Then the number of games would be decided. Race to 5, which would be the first one to notch 5 victories, a race to 10 maybe, and for how much? That first set of games, the money didn't really matter. Both sides were trying to figure out how good the other guy was. Sometimes the loser would pay and everyone would move on. But other times the hustle was on. But you could never be sure who was hustling who. I once witnessed a race to 100 games between two guys who were very evenly matched, and it took hours. The action was so incredible that none of us noticed that it had started snowing, and by the time the match was decided, no one could leave. The entire parking lot was snowed in. We all slept on the floor underneath the tables and had to wait for the snowplows the next morning. The reason I bring up my time at Sterling Billiards is because within that same small shopping plaza was a video store, which in the days before Netflix and Amazon and a million other streaming services is where people went to rent movies on videotape. And just as there are a ton of streaming services today, there were tons of mom and pop video stores across the globe that thrived in the 80s and 90s. Eventually, they all began to coalesce into a handful of major corporations before eventually there was only Blockbuster Video. But once upon a time, a kid like me could get a job at a local video store outside of all of that corporate nonsense. And that's what I did. Welcome back to The Devil Within. You're listening to Haunted Hollywood Part 4, The Dark Side of the Rainbow. So one day as I was leaving the pool hall, I heard my mother's voice in my head about getting a job, and I noticed the help wanted sign hanging in the window of the video store. I applied and was hired a few days later. After being trained on the register, the rewind machine, and the first-generation computerized inventory system, my job was basically watching movies while I waited for customers in a very not busy and soon-to-be-closed video store. They also had a pinball machine that ate up a lot of my time, but mostly I watched movies and read the industry newsletters. All this for $4.25 an hour. Now, I wish I could say my time spent working in a movie rental house inspired me in the way Quentin Tarantino was inspired. But not quite. Yes, I loved movies, but I loved books more, and I still do. For me, it was just a high school job. But during one shift, I noticed that the latest VHS rental owner newsletter had arrived, and I began flipping through it. And that's where I saw a short, one-page article with crazy, spooky graphics surrounding it that detailed a handful of hauntings, deaths, and other macabre events that not only happened on movie sets, but actually mistakenly made it into the final cut of popular movies. Movies that, if you happen to own a rental store or work in one, were on your shelves right now. The first movie mentioned in this truly creepy article concerned the 1987 comedy 3 Men and a Baby. The title sums up the movie really well. 3 bachelors, roommates actually, are suddenly tasked with taking care of a baby, and funny things happen. So there's a point in the film where one of these guys' moms shows up to help, and as she arrives, the camera follows her from the front door of the apartment all the way to the bedroom and then back in one long, unbroken shot. So we get to see most of the apartment, including all of the windows that look out over New York City from high above street level. According to the article, they shot the movie on location in a high-rise apartment in Midtown Manhattan. Now, the legend goes that at some point in the not-too-distant past, there was a tragedy involving a young boy who fell out of a window in that apartment, and his ghost appears in the movie. If you're not looking for it, you'll miss it. But when you see it, okay, it's right after the woman picks up the baby and walks back towards the front door. In the background, there are a few windows, brightly lit by the afternoon sun, and standing in one of them, partially concealed by a curtain, is a boy in a baseball hat. He looks to be about 10, maybe 11 years old. Again, when you see it, it's unmistakable. There's a kid there. That kid, or any kid that age, doesn't appear in the movie. I so clearly remember watching that scene in that empty video store all alone and being completely freaked out. Another mention in the newsletter concerned possibly the most classic of classic films ever made, The Wizard of Oz. So, it's at a point in the movie before they meet the Cowardly Lion. It's just Dorothy, Scarecrow, and the Tin Man, and they're dancing and singing their way along the yellow brick road as it curves off to the right, and you can clearly see, in the dead center of the frame, a figure, slightly swinging from one of the fake trees. Conspiracy theorists will tell you that the hanging figure is a dwarf actor who played one of the famous Munchkins in the film. The treatment of the Munchkin corps of actors was allegedly horrific, which we'll explore in a minute, and caused one of them to, unfortunately, commit suicide. And, also allegedly, this actor was so familiar with the inner workings of the set that he knew exactly where to do it, so his final act would be captured on film. There have been statements issued since this accusation was first voiced that attest to explain away the swinging figure, including that it was supposed to be a bird that was placed there to add realism to the forest scene. But when you see it, it's very obviously not a bird. Honestly, it looks like a person hanging from a tree. But it was that alleged incident that led me recently to dig a little deeper into The Wizard of Oz. And man, there is no shortage of information regarding just how difficult a time nearly everyone involved in the making of the movie had, with some even saying that the film was cursed. Lyman Frank Baum was 44 years old in the year 1900 when his book, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, was first published. Baum had failed as both a playwright and a newspaper publisher and had taken work as a traveling salesman before finding near instant success and critical acclaim for The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. In all, Baum would produce 14 novels set in the fictional land of Oz, and in 1902, a stage version of the story was produced and landed on Broadway for nearly a 2-year run, before becoming a touring production across the United States until 1911. Baum would die of a stroke in 1919, just a few days shy of his 63rd birthday. After the creation of the stage play, nearly all versions of the story used the shortened title, The Wizard of Oz, including the 1939 movie. But it was the 1937 Disney film, the groundbreaking Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, that convinced the money guys at the studios that fairy tales and children's stories could be profitable as movies, and that caused the powerhouse studio, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, to acquire the rights to Baum's book, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. The all-powerful, micromanaging, somewhat unstable head of the studio, Louis B. Mayer, called for several rewrites of the script, although he had assigned production to a man named Mervyn LeRoy and told LeRoy who was going to be cast in which part. When the final script was approved in October of 1938, everyone understood that Dorothy would be the character that the entire film would depend on. Naturally, for that time, the legendary Shirley Temple was seriously considered for the part, even though she wasn't known for her singing voice and the movie was very much a musical. Plus, by this time, Shirley Temple was almost 11 years old. And this is going to sound awful, but the consensus among the studios was that she had aged out of all the qualities that made the world fall in love with her. She wasn't the beautiful little kid who could sing and dance and command a crowd. She was an adolescent now. She was growing up, and her act had lost its luster. Brutal, I know, but it was true for that time. And in many ways, true for our times. How many child stars aren't able to make the transition into adolescent, teen, and adult careers? Geez, most of them, right? There are notable exceptions in every generation, but for the most part, we don't like to see our child stars grow up. So the studio looked elsewhere to find their Dorothy, and they wouldn't have to look far. Judy Garland was born Frances Ethel Gumm on June 10, 1922, in Grand Rapids, Minnesota. The youngest of three sisters, her parents were vaudeville performers who owned a theater in Grand Rapids. In June of 1926, after the community discovered that Garland's father was a gay man, the family felt the need to relocate and finally settled in Lancaster, California, a city about 40 miles north of Los Angeles. In Lancaster, they bought a theater and continued their vaudeville act while Mom began the process of getting her talented daughters into the movie business. All three of the Gumm sisters went through extensive training to develop their singing and dancing abilities and regularly appeared in Christmas pageants in Los Angeles and other musical review-type productions. The sisters' first film appearance was in 1929, and they would appear together on a near constant basis until 1935, when the oldest of the Gumm sisters left to marry a music man in Reno. However, the two younger sisters kept their vaudeville act going as a duo now and rebranded themselves as the Garland Sisters. Louis B. Mayer of MGM Studios caught wind of the girls' act and called young Judy Garland in to audition at his Culver City studio. She was immediately signed to a contract, although she was at a tough age. 13 was too old for little kid roles, but too young for adult roles. Plus, as she grew, she never got any taller. Judy Garland topped out at under 5 feet tall. But she could sing, and soon MGM found success with a string of musicals starring Judy Garland alongside a young Mickey Rooney. When Garland was not quite 17, she was officially cast as Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz. And while, at the time, it was the best thing to happen to her career, it was also the beginning of the end for the young star. So let's skip to the crazy shit, because apparently there was a ton of it. First of all, the studio was just awful to Judy Garland. Allegedly, Mayer himself was concerned about Garland's weight and overall appearance to the point where he mandated a diet of chicken breast and black coffee, plus, no joke, 80 cigarettes a day to curb her appetite. That's 4 packs of unfiltered 1930s cigarettes every day for a 17-year-old singer. Plus, her schedule was micromanaged down to the minute. Look, I get it. The studio was spending a ton of money on the movie, $2.7 million, which was second that year only to MGM's other tentpole drama, Gone with the Wind, which had a budget of just over $3 million. So they were looking to mitigate their financial risks as much as possible over the 15-week shoot. So Garland would wear a corset that flattened her breasts so she could look closer to 12 than 17, and she would sleep when they told her to, and they would make sure of it by drugging her with barbiturates to ensure that she would rest. Then, usually after a mere 4 hours of sleep, they would force her to wake up and take her, quote, pep pills, which were just strong amphetamines that would soon after be used to fuel American infantrymen in the European theater of World War II. With Garland hopped up on these pep pills, they could shoot for 2 days straight before she was near collapse. The actor originally cast as the Tin Man suffered a severe allergic reaction to the aluminum paint that covered his body, and they had to recast the part. And the foam latex effects on the face of the Cowardly Lion were glued on so firmly every day that permanent marks were left on the actor's skin. And with a cast of more than 600 total actors, which required more than 1,000 costumes in total, there was apparently a lot of leeway for some truly terrible behavior on set. Allegations of sexual misconduct, groping, and assault were supposedly widespread and ranged from cast and crew all the way up to Mayer himself. As for the little people cast in the film, they were found after an exhaustive search by a talent agent in Hollywood known for his retinue of little people from vaudeville shows. But The Wizard of Oz needed many more than he had available. The cast called for a full 125 dwarf actors with specific proportions, and, awkwardly consistent for the times, no little people of color were to be considered. Once hired, each dwarf actor signed a contract for $100 per week, of which the aforementioned agent took a 50% commission. Remember, this was before union protections were as strong as they are today, and their coverage didn't include talent agents or managers. Also of note, the dog that played Toto earned $125 per week. So the actors playing the Munchkins were officially the lowest paid cast members on the set of The Wizard of Oz. Many people in the crew hadn't worked with little people before and were unsure how to treat them, which usually resulted in insulting behavior, such as picking them up and lifting them into the makeup chair or talking to them as if they were children. In one unfortunate incident, it's alleged that a Munchkin actor got drunk during lunch and fell into a toilet where they were found once they couldn't get out. From then on, the humiliating rule was imposed that all dwarf actors needed to be escorted to the bathroom by a tall person. And then there's the infamous Culver Hotel, an upscale establishment that catered to movie stars and was located within shouting distance of MGM Studios. All dwarf actors were lodged in the Culver Hotel during filming, and the stories that have emerged from those 8 weeks are astonishing, unsubstantiated, but still interesting to discuss. The dwarfs' time at the Culver Hotel have become legendary, with reports of violence, orgies, rampant alcohol and drug abuse, and several instances that required a massive police presence, resulting in dozens of arrests. As for the film's antagonist, the Wicked Witch of the West, there were 2 instances where the early use of on-set pyrotechnics failed miserably. In a scene where the Wicked Witch disappears in a puff of smoke, the pyrotechnic was allegedly set off too early before the actor could get out of the way, and the flammable green makeup on her hands and face ignited, causing severe burns that persisted throughout the shoot. In a telling interview just a few years later, she was asked why she didn't sue the studio for damages. She replied that she knew if she sued, she would be blacklisted, and she really wanted to continue working as an actor in Hollywood. When she was well enough to return to the Wizard of Oz set, her first shot was supposed to be the famous Surrender Dorothy scene, which also required the same smoke effect. So she elected to have a stunt double perform the scene. And the same thing happened, causing an eerily similar set of injuries to the stunt double. So whether or not a Munchkin actor hanged himself on the set, some legitimate sources debunk the claim while others bolster it. Or whether or not actors were treated horribly, or makeup poisoned the Tin Man, it did. Or makeup also ignited a woman's face, it did twice. Or even if someone stepped on Toto and broke the dog's ankle. True story. The lasting damage to Judy Garland is the true casualty of The Wizard of Oz. Haunted by an inferiority complex caused by her treatment as a young actress under contract at MGM, Garland would spend the rest of her life plagued by alcohol and drug abuse, failed relationships including 5 marriages, career ups and downs that led to financial instability, and a massive debt owed to the federal government due to unpaid taxes. She would often shine in her later performances, perhaps never so brightly as her turn in the first remake of A Star is Born, for which she was nominated for an Academy Award and was considered the frontrunner until the award went to Grace Kelly for 1954's The Country Girl. Though a critical success, the film underperformed at the box office and failed to make back the production budget, further weighing down Garland's financial situation as she was an investor in the film. In 1959, Garland was diagnosed with acute hepatitis and given less than 5 years to live. Rather than this death sentence causing her anxiety and fear, it actually instilled a sense of peace, and she was quoted as saying she was greatly relieved because for the first time in her life, she felt no pressure to succeed. She would, however, make a full recovery, and that 5-year diagnosis was amended. In the early 1960s, Garland would find success, both critical and financial, with the CBS weekly special, The Judy Garland Show, which should have set her up financially for the rest of her life, as it was, at the time, the largest contract in history for CBS to pay a weekly performer. On June 22, 1969, Garland would be found dead by her husband in the bathroom of their home in London. The coroner's inquest would conclude that Garland died of an accidental barbiturate overdose. There was an additional report that stated she was suffering from severe cirrhosis of the liver and was essentially living on borrowed time. This assessment, however, was challenged by her own doctor. Nevertheless, the bright light that was Judy Garland was extinguished, and many believe that her early death can be traced back to what was, for all practical purposes, her first and greatest hit, The Wizard of Oz. In her last will and testament, she made many generous bequeathments that were unable to be paid out due to her, once again, precarious financial situation. After all the movies, all the success, all the fame, upon her death, her estate was worth a mere $40,000, an amount far outweighed by her debt. In the years following her death, her daughter, the great Liza Minnelli, and Garland's longtime friend Frank Sinatra would settle her debts and finally give the rest of her family peace. As of 2023, The Wizard of Oz held the title as the single most watched feature film in human history. Thanks for listening. Be sure to follow The Devil Within wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. You can also check out our socials at The Devil Within Pod on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Until next time, stay safe out there. The Devil Within is a Cloud 10 Media production, recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. Written and produced by Brandon Morgan. Executive produced by Sim Sarna. Our post-production supervisor is Bruce Whitkin, who also provided original music for this episode. For The Devil Within, I'm your host, Brandon Morgan.